Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome in. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. But as I mentioned in the chat, we would love for everybody to share where they are joining from, what kind of weather you're having, that kind of thing. I'm joining from Abilene, Texas, 2 hours west of Dallas. It still feels like summertime. We had a high of 88 degrees today, sunny skies. So it doesn't even feel quite autumnal yet. But yeah, please let us know where you're joining from. Looks like a couple North Carolinians. Aloha from Hawaii.
Ooh.
That's must be a pleasant place to be at right now.
Mhm.
Sacramento, Wheaton, Illinois, Boston, Massachusetts. Susan's joining us from the Delta, Mississippi Delta.
I'm from South Carolina.
All right, South Carolina.
I just put that in, but it came up saying I was the Jane Austen summer program.
Yes. And Christina Papp joining from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Seattle, Washington,
Sarasota, Oregon City.
Oh, wow. Very good.
No rain on Long Island.
All right. Chicago area. 80. Yeah, I heard Chicago is also very warm, unseasonably warm this time of year.
Wow.
Okay, very good. Old Lyme, Connecticut.
Oh,
wonderful. I bet the fall foliage is lovely.
Brazil.
Okay. Greetings from Brazil.
Vancouver.
There's some international folks. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, in just another minute, we'll get started. We're just going to wait for more people to join. We're so excited to be back for round 2 of Austen and the Brontes after, I think, about a 6-month hiatus. In our last episode, we had the curators from the Jane Austen House Museum and the Bronte Parsonage join, and that's kind of where we left things off in May. We're excited to be back for a couple more episodes. All right, welcome those from Western Massachusetts, San Francisco, Phoenix. Finally below 100 degrees in Phoenix. I can feel that. Very good. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Please keep sharing where you're joining from. My name is Eric Bontempo. I'm one of the co-directors of Jane Austen and Company, as well as the Jane Austen Summer Program. I'm joined tonight by my fellow co-hosts, Susan Allen Ford and Deb Barnum. Our technical director, returning once more, is Nadea Pugh, who is now a senior at UNC. So congrats on making it to your senior year. Jane Austen and Company has been around since 2019. And going back to 2019, Jane Austen and Company has aimed to provide top-notch programming related to Jane Austen. It started as in-person events at local libraries in the Triangle. And for the past couple of years, we've been primarily delivering content through virtual formats, whether it's through Zoom or through YouTube. Like I said, tonight we are continuing our series on Austen and the Brontes, which we began earlier this year with 4 events, and we're going to continue that through the rest of 2024 with 4 more events. Yeah. And Nadea, were you able to share our series poster for our schedule for this upcoming year? There we go.
So before tonight's talk from Winter Jade Werner, we want to highlight the 3 upcoming talks that will follow tonight's event. We have Claire O'Callaghan on November 7th, our own Deb Barnum on November 19th, and Maria Frawley on December 3rd. And we hope to have one additional event on the horizon. We're really excited to close out 2024 with such an amazing lineup of speakers.
Nadea, do you want to post the image for? There you go. Thank you. So please visit our website to get more information about the entire slate of speakers for this series. Our website is janeaustenandco.org. You'll put that in the chat, right? Our next event on November 7th will feature Dr. Claire O'Callaghan, senior lecturer in Victorian literature at Loughborough University and editor-in-chief of the academic journal Brontë Studies. Claire's research focuses on the Brontes, and she has published widely on their lives and works, including the short public history book, Emily Brontë, Reappraised from 2018. That was published for Emily's bicentenary. More recently, Claire has focused on the Brontes' letters and health, and that is the subject of her talk, as she compares Cassandra Austen's grief over losing her beloved sister Jane to Charlotte Bronte's similar emotional pain after losing several family members.
Tonight's events, in fact, this whole season on Austen and Brontë, including our upcoming events, is made possible by the North Carolina Humanities Council, which is a statewide nonprofit and the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities that connects North Carolinians with the cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connection, and inspire community. And we at Jane Austen and Company are very grateful for support from the NC Humanities Council.
And now I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker. Winter Jade Werner is Associate Professor of English and the Jane E. Ruby Chair for the Humanities and Social Sciences at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. She's author of Missionary Cosmopolitanism in 19th Century British Literature, which came out in 2020. And with Joshua King of Baylor University, she's the co-editor of
So you want me to finish, Susan?
Please, Deb, yeah.
So the co-editor with Joshua King of Constructing 19th Century Religion, Literary, Historical, and Religious Studies and Dialogue from 2019. Her essays appear or are forthcoming in journals including Comparative Literature, MLQ, Romantic Circles, Praxis, 19th Century Literature, 19th Century Contexts, and Dickens Studies Annual. With Sebastian Lecourt from the University of Houston, she is co-editor of a forthcoming special issue on religion, empire, and the state of the field in Victorian literature. Professor Werner's current research examines the role of foreign missionary presses in the development of the 19th century idea of world literature. So before Jade begins her talk, which should last about 45 minutes, our technical director, Nadia, will explain how you can send in questions during and after her presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Deb, for that introduction. Hi, everybody. Welcome to YouTube, our streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, please use the comment feature on the sidebar, and we'll collect your comments throughout the presentation. And then in the Q&A after the presentation, Jade can answer your questions and comments and respond to all the lovely comments that you leave. So please get those comments and questions in. We really do love to hear from you, and our speakers really love to know your thoughts on their presentations. You will need to log into your Google or YouTube account to post in that, like using that comment feature in the sidebar. But if you don't have a YouTube or Google account, that's okay as well. And you can just submit your questions to info@janeaustenandco.org, and then we'll post them for you.
All right. And now, without further ado, we present Dr. Winter Jade Werner and her talk on Mixed Spirits and Contested Unions, Mansfield Park, Jane Eyre, and the Missionary Marriage Dilemma.
Thanks so much. And just to get us started, I'll just say I'm zooming in from Rhode Island, actually. I live just outside of Providence, Rhode Island, and we are enjoying beautiful weather, which my kids are really excited about because it means that they're going to have 70-degree weather when they go out for trick-or-treating. Okay, so it is such a pleasure to be here today. I just want to first start off by saying thanks to Eric, Nadia, Susan, Deb for facilitating this event. I am really humbled and honored by this opportunity to engage with all of you as part of this wonderful series on Austen and the Brontes. But as someone who studies 19th century Protestant culture, I do feel compelled to open with something of a confession, and that is I do not study Jane Austen. So You are probably wondering right now, why on earth is somebody presenting as part of this person, presenting as part of Jane Austen and Company? But let me just say, before you decide to log off, I am a huge admirer of Jane, and I regularly teach her novels. In fact, I just want to show you my copy, my teaching copy of Mansfield Park. Despite my non-Austenite status, I really hope to bring something interesting to the table today. And this is my interest in 19th century missionary work and the ways in which a forgotten episode in missionary history might inform our understanding of some of the religious themes of her novels. So now, as you may know, the missionary movement was everywhere in early 19th century Britain. Nadea, next slide, please. Thank you. Jane Austen and Charlotte Brontë, both the daughters of clergymen, were themselves up to date on the happenings within the evangelical missionary movement. And even more, they shared an awareness of the fact that missionary work abroad had distinct social implications at home. So before I get too far ahead of myself, I do want to acknowledge that for me, bringing Brontë into an Austen-centric gathering can feel a bit like bringing a cat into a dog show, because Bronte's dislike of Pride and Prejudice is the stuff of literary legend. But I don't want to wade into the merits of Bronte's opinions today, nor am I really interested in speculating about whether one of Austen's other novels would have changed Charlotte's mind. So instead, I'll discuss how an overlooked facet of missionary work can help us see what unites these two literary giants, particularly in the way that their novels weave together various concerns that at first glance seem, I think, distinct and unrelated. Next slide. To do so, I want to talk about the peculiar manner in which Mansfield Park and Jane Eyre both stage anxieties about colonial wealth, specifically colonial wealth connected to the West Indies, and how they both frame this wealth as dangerous and morally corrupting. And I also want to suggest that they both offer symbolic or imaginative cures for this corruption in the marriages or almost marriages of their explicitly religious characters. So we have in hand a sort of wide-ranging set of issues being explored in these novels: the moral rot of colonial expansion, religious belief, marriage. And I think, right, that these issues seem at first glance so dissimilar as to be unrelated. Colonialism, for instance, is a global problem, a political problem, and marriage, by contrast, is usually considered to be the most domestic and intimate of relations. But in the early 19th century, I want to suggest that the ethics of marriage, particularly in religious circles, came to be connected to the broader geopolitical sphere by way of a brief but significant episode in British missionary work. And this was the period from roughly the beginning of the 19th century to the 18 teens, wherein missionary societies not only tolerated, but encouraged interracial marriage between missionaries and their native converts. So let me flesh this out a bit more, because I think it's a historical moment that might be unfamiliar to some. In these first years of what scholars call the modern missionary movement, next slide, please. Missionary societies invoke the idea of universal kinship to justify their international outreach. This was the idea that all humanity was a single family derived from the original pairing of Adam and Eve. At the end of the 19th century, universal kinship had mostly become a figment of rhetoric. In fact, such claims of universal brotherhood belied Imperial Britain's ever stricter policing against intermixing. But this wasn't quite the state of affairs at the beginning of the century. For a very brief moment in time, some mission societies experimented with giving proof and body to the idea of universal kinship by encouraging missionaries to enter interracial marriages. But over the years, these marriages proved problematic for missionary societies. While they literalized the metaphor of universal kinship, as Indigenous women actually became the actual kin, right, of white missionary families, they also undermined assumptions of British Christians' natural superiority over the so-called natives, assumptions which had underwritten missionary work in the first place. Perhaps unsurprisingly, missionary societies began abandoning interracial marriage, increasingly figuring it as a source and expression of moral corruption. And concurrently, they began recommending that white missionaries take proper British wives before heading out to the mission field as a sort of protective measure against what they increasingly portrayed to be the temptations of Native women. So for me, who studies this weird historical moment, it's striking that Mansfield Park and Jane Eyre stage respectively a marriage and an almost marriage between two like-minded religionists. And what's more, seem to insist that we understand these pairings as somehow responding to Britain's expanding empire. So that's the substance of my talk today. And here's the order in which I want to explore these issues. First, I'll outline the history of missionary intermarriage. Then I'm going to turn to Mansfield Park. And finally, hopefully to bring things together, I'm going to turn to Jane Eyre and really look at Jane's near marriage to her missionary cousin, St. John River. So let me go ahead and get started with part one. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is part one. Dependent on voluntary contributions, missionary societies throughout the first decades of the 19th century relied on the notion of universal kinship to inspire pity and sympathy for the plight of the so-called heathen overseas. Sympathy, as you'll see on my slide here, announced the Baptist Missionary Society in 1826, is one of the most amiable feelings. Shall we not deeply feel for those who are bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh? Shall we not extend our view to the whole world? And similarly, the London Missionary Society, or LMS as I'm going to call it, declared in its annual report for 1827 that, quote, it was the design of the Creator that a feeling of universal brotherhood should bind together the whole human family, end quote. The sentiment perhaps found its best expression in the popular abolition motto. Next slide, please. Am I not a man and a brother? And this motto might be familiar to some of you. Implicit in this motto was the evangelical conviction that common manhood indicated common brotherhood, and that the revelation of sharing blood in a common origin would simulate compassion for the distant heathen in British hearts. So next slide. The donation lists included in each issue of the Evangelical Magazine and Missionary Chronicle offer a striking example of how far missionary societies went in cultivating these feelings of kinship. So in exchange for monetary donations, the London Missionary Society allowed its subscribers to give Christian names to newly converted children. And you can actually see this here. These are my own pictures, so forgive me if they're not that clear. But regularly, I hope you can see, donors bestowed their family surnames on these children. A brief glance at this 1843 issue of the Evangelical Magazine reveals that the practice was common enough. With her donation of £3, for instance, Mrs. Jacob gave the name Nathaniel Pierce Jacob to a boy in Calcutta, and Mrs. Schroeder, for a donation of £5, had a native girl in South Africa renamed Sarah Schroeder. And it's worth mentioning that the CMS did this too. So undoubtedly, this renaming was a sort of cultural imperialism, but it also seems to indicate that missionary supporters, in their eagerness to give these children their own family names, took seriously the idea of Christian universal kinship. And I might even go further than this. What this episode suggests is that for some British evangelicals, universal kinship was an idea that could be enacted, actually put into practice. So in the very first years of missionary work, intermarriage and not renaming children emerged as a primary way by which missionary societies evinced their dedication to mankind's oneness. To fully understand why this happened, we first have to understand the peculiar heft mission societies assigned to marriage, particularly in relation to ideas of kinship. Of course, as scholars like Sharon Marcus have observed, marriage was important because it was what created ties of kinship in the first place. But even more, marriage was also the relationship that supposedly epitomized these feelings of being akin. Next slide. Evangelical societies in particular conceived of matrimony as a bond of perfect openness, communication, communion, in short, kinship between married parties. The Missionary Chronicle, for example, remarked in an 1816 essay that matrimony meant two that are kindred souls in body and spirit, uniting before the throne of grace to seem like one spirit. And when Sarah Lewis argued in her Pan to Domestic Womanhood, Women's Mission, that female influences in motherhood and matrimony act by a sort of moral contagion and are imbibed by the receiver as they flow from their source without consciousness on either side, she reinforced this already prevalent notion that openness and unconscious reciprocity of influence characterize the best Christian marriages. Next slide. So I specify these attributes because they help us understand why missionary societies would tell their missionaries, to use the words of one LMS founder, they would do well to form matrimonial connections with the first converts of their natives. If all people in the world were equal and already shared the same blood, and if, moreover, marriage was the nearest and dearest relation two people could share, why not permit, even encourage interracial unions? And moreover, there was, so missionary societies thought, much to be materially gained from these unions. If, for instance, missionaries married indigenous women of the ruling aristocracy, they would have political power over the local community and could more effectively convert people. As the historian Jeffrey Cox puts it, practical considerations, Christian universalism, and Christian teaching on the sanctity of marriage thus converge to uphold the legality, if not the wisdom, of interracial unions. But as historians have also noticed, British missionaries also helped precipitate something like the formal end of interracial marriage, at least as a practice that previously had been more or less quietly tolerated in the late 18th century by, for instance, trading companies. So what happened? To account for this missionary U-turn on intermarriage, I'm going to zoom in on a couple of key cases. Next slide, please. So during the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss my research on figures such as the LMS missionary George Vason in Polynesia. And I just have an excerpt right here from his narrative, as well as an image that I'm going to come back to in a moment. But for the sake of time today, I want to zoom in on two missionary intermarriages in South Africa that had particularly troubled the London Missionary Society. Next slide. So when the LMS first started sending missionaries to the region, it urged them to find wives from among the native converts. As the historian Julia Wells notes in respect to the African missions, quote, "It is clear that the LMS in its early years did little or nothing to dissuade its missionaries from marrying African women. In those days, missionaries wrote home about the exemplary achievements of colleagues who had African wives, often giving credit to the women for their role in smoothing over cultural difference," end quote. But within 7 years, a very different set of reports started trickling in. And these reports, usually authored by explorers, white settlers in South Africa, and missionaries who had decided to marry white settlers, detailed the shocking and, for the LMS, utterly humiliating ways that missionaries in these interracial unions had adopted their wives' customs, in effect going native. The renowned missionary James Reed, for instance, was castigated in reports for, and this is a direct quote, living shoeless in a clay hut with his indigenous wife, and I actually find this kind of funny, and giving up bread, tea, and coffee when he cannot afford them. It's so horrifying, right? Just absolutely unthinkable. Even more shocking to British readers, though, was the apparent backsliding of one of the LMS's most famous missionaries at the time. And this is the other person on the slide, Vanderkamp, who you can see right here. In 1806, just 5 years before his death, an elderly Vanderkamp took a 13-year-old Malagasy girl as his wife. And interestingly, the race of Vanderkamp's wife was just as scandalous as her age, and reports of the union decimated Vanderkamp's reputation in the British press. Vanderkamp sneered the conservative-leaning New Monthly magazine in 1814 had, quote, "took unto himself a Hottentot Venus of 13, and like the Santon Barissa, sacrificed a long life of piety and benevolence to a few days of spiritualized concupiscence," end quote. Such accounts unnerved missionary societies back in Britain. These marriages, which had appeared to be commendable examples of racial tolerance and cross-cultural communication, increasingly appeared to be the germ of corruption, the rot eating away at white missionaries' supposed moral and cultural purity. And what particularly troubled missionary societies, as well as the British public more generally, was that in these interracial unions, suggestions of an inherent European superiority melted away as Indigenous women became intimate partners of their husbands. By the 18 teens, missionary societies had come to view intermarriage as both evidence of and the catalyst for the missionaries' moral and social degeneration. An 1823 missionary history extrapolating from Vanderkemp's case proclaimed, and this is a direct quote again, quote, "A connection so unequal not only sinks a man in the eyes of the world, but tends insensibly to debase the tone of his own mind and manners," end quote. And to account for this debasement, which was so contrary to missionary society's original expectations of these unions, Indigenous women were increasingly represented in missionary writing as voluptuous, indolent, alluring objects of sexual desire. White missionaries then could not but be tempted by such tremendously alluring women, to use George Vason's quote, right? Like in such tremendously alluring, hot, exotic locales. And next slide, please. So this is the illustration I wanted to go back to, right? It's the image from Vason's book, which portrays some of these alluring women in this tremendously alluring scene. However, still unable or unwilling to outright ban interracial marriage because of their outward commitment to universal kinship, missionary societies adopted a clever strategy to stigmatize interracial marriage, but without outlawing it. They started to urge their missionaries to take a British wife before heading out to the mission field. And we can see this new policy in the writings of influential missiologists, such as the American Rufus Anderson, who argued that the missionary in possession of an American or European wife would be protected from, in his words, quote, "temptations that violated the laws of purity," end quote. So what's curious, I think, in this history of controversy is that these interracial marriages didn't exactly fail, right? Not exactly. That is, these marriages seem, to the horror of missionary societies, actually to live up to British Christian expectations of marriage. Marriage in these cases seemed indeed the union of kindred souls and in body and spirit, and taking a native wife was a sort of moral contagion. And you can think, right, about the ways that missionaries, for instance, took up living in clay huts with and going shoeless. So this was the irony. The very language used to defend interracial unions proved also the very rhetoric by which they were eventually denounced. This is, I think, a symptom of the paradoxical nature of missionary ideas surrounding universal kinship. The more that they attempted to realize universal kinship by way of intermarriage, the more uncomfortable they became in their apparent success in opening such intercultural and interracial channels of sympathy, influence, family, moral contagion. This then is the historical background to which I want to refer. Now I'm going to turn to Jane Austen to discuss some of the ways this history might haunt Mansfield Park and also Sanditon. Next slide, please. And then we'll move to the next one. So on August 26, 1813, Jane Austen donated half a guinea towards the formation of the District Committee of the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, which was the oldest Anglican mission organization in Britain. On the surface of things, half a guinea doesn't look like much, but as the Austen scholar Jocelyn Harris has noted, the contribution was, in fact, quite handsome given Austen's financial situation at the time. And interestingly, this donation very nearly coincided with the completion of Austen's manuscript for Mansfield Park just a month earlier in July 1813. So Mansfield Park, published in 1814, is often characterized as Austen's evangelical novel. In his introduction to the Oxford Classics edition, James Kinsley, for example, notes, "The language of Mansfield Park often echoes the evangelical idiom of exacting high standards and keen scrutiny of inner motivation, while Felicia Bonaparte suggests that the novel calls for a new religion, one that touches what we are in our very essence. So, what Mansfield Park calls for, in other words, is a renewal of the religion of the heart. But I think the spiritual undercurrent runs parallel to another major theme in the novel: British imperialism and its moral failings. Mansfield Park intertwines these themes of imperialism and religious revivalism in fascinating ways. And I want to suggest it's by understanding the missionary context for this novel that we can see how and why Mansfield Park insists that its explorations of family, marriage, religion, and empire are conjoined. My starting point is going to be Reverend Michael Giffin's treatment of Mansfield Park. So, according to Giffin, Mansfield Park, next slide, please. Okay, that can be read as a manifesto that outlines Austen's awareness of the modernist state in disorder and the established church in need of spiritual renewal. The novel opens on an outwardly flourishing but inwardly rotten Bertram family estate. From the very first chapters, we get hints that the eldest son, Tom, is bound for a life of dissipation, while the beauty and vivacity of the two Bertram daughters, Julia and Maria, barely covers for the fact that they are fatally superficial and vain. These faults, Austen submits, is a result, in large part, of poor parenting. Sir Thomas is a too distant and too severe father, Lady Bertram an indolent and self-absorbed mother. Next slide, please. Underlying the shaky moral foundation of the Bertram family is an unstable economic foundation. The prosperity of the Mansfield Park estate hinges on Sir Thomas's Antiguan plantation, which undoubtedly relies on slave labor. In the novel's third chapter, Sir Thomas is compelled to depart for this plantation, which we later learn is beset by unfavorable circumstances and great uncertainty. Given Austen's well-known sympathies with the abolitionist movement and her admiration for the anti-slavery writer Thomas Clarkson, we might interpret these allusions to Sir Thomas's uncertain holdings as her muted critique, very muted, but muted, a critique nonetheless, of the source of his wealth. So the seeds of the Bertrams' eventual downfall are thus sown not only in their individual character flaws, but also in the morally compromised foundation of the estate itself. Next slide. But I want to make my case a bit stronger by triangulating among Mansfield Park, Sanditon, and Austen's biography. In her essay on the West Indian presence in Austen's novels, the literary critic Elaine Jordan argues that Austen portrays Sir Thomas not so much as a guardian and exemplar of English tradition, but rather as a West Indian himself. And by this, Jordan refers to those Britons, or in her words, Creoles settling in Britain, who had vested property and political interests in the plantation and slave economy. The Bertrams' West Indianness is signaled, for instance, in Sir Thomas's flawed ideas about education and Lady Bertram's pronounced indolence and self-absorption, which aligns with stereotypical depictions of Creole women from this era. Jordan's arguments gain more credibility when we consider their roots in Austen's biography. As many of you probably know, Austen's father was college friends with James Langston Nibbs, a plantation owner who, like Sir Thomas, sent his older son to Antigua to curb his extravagant behavior in England. But unlike Tom Bertram in Mansfield Park, Nibbs' own son never returned. And moreover, Nibbs had another son, Christopher, who was biracial, illegitimate, and enslaved, who also perished in Antigua. And the point here is that while we can't be certain of Austen's knowledge of the full Nibbs' family history, the episode underscores that the horrors of the West Indies were not mere abstractions to Austen's social circle. This biographical context reinforces an important point. Austen implicates the moral corruption of the Bertram household with the widely perceived moral and racial corruption that was associated with West Indian colonial society. And the specific failings Austen assigns to the Bertram family members, parental detachment, ignorance, indolence, constitutional weakness, and susceptibility to temptation and sensual pleasures, mirror British stereotypes of dissolute West Indian colonial families. Next slide. So Austen's familiarity with the stereotypes attached to these West Indian families is especially evinced in her unfinished novel, Sanditon. Sanditon features a West Indian heiress, Miss Lamb, and through her character, Austen explores the prevailing stereotypes attached to West Indian families. We see these stereotypes initially voiced through Diana Parker's misguided impressions of the Griffiths family and their supposed charge, Miss Lamb. Diana opines, Miss Lamb has an immense fortune, richer than all the rest, and very delicate health. One sees clearly enough by all this the sort of woman Mrs. G must be, as helpless and indolent as wealth and a hot climate are apt to make us. And even when Diana Parker's assumption about the composition of the Griffiths family proves incorrect, the novel suggests that her assessment of West Indian wealth and the West Indian moral and physical constitution still holds pretty true. Here's the subsequent description we get of Miss Lamb. She was about 17, here's from the novel. She was about 17, half mulatto, chilly and tender, had a maid of her own, end quote. Austen's attention to Miss Lamb's race, the critic Elaine Jordan proposes, suggests a fear of cross-race reproduction because such miscegenation signals for Austen, quote, a more profound distress at the damage done by universalizing modern culture in which commercial interests dominate, end quote. So it's in this manner that the content and context of Mansfield Park and Sanditon explore a dizzying array of issues centered on race, family, and the moral implications of colonial wealth. Next slide. So it's into Mansfield Park's scene of dissolution and economic corruption that Fanny Price arrives with the earnestness and often moral clarity of a religious revivalist. And here's a nice illustration of Fanny that appears on the left-hand side. I'm not quite sure how this is showing up, but on one side of the slide. Her piety is starkly contrasted with the superficial religion of her cousins Maria and Julia, who are, quote, instructed theoretically in their religion, but never required to bring it into daily practice, end quote. And moreover, her natural religious feeling is given definite shape by her cousin Edmund Bertram, who the novel tells us famously, quote, formed her mind and gained her affections, end quote. Edmund himself is portrayed as a serious religionist, his moral severity becoming a point of mockery for his first love interest and Fanny's rival, Mary Crawford. You may remember in their last conversation with each other that Mary teases Edmund, a pretty good lecture upon my word. Was it part of your last sermon? When I hear of you next, it may be as a celebrated preacher in some great society of Methodists, or as a missionary into foreign parts. While Mary intends these as epithets, the novel makes clear that Edmund's fervent religiosity is preferable to Mary's frivolity. But in light of the history I outlined earlier, I want to suggest that these allusions to Methodism and missionary work are especially significant in the context of the philosophy of marriage the novel explores by way of Edmund, Mary, Fanny Price, and Henry Crawford. So it's something of a critical commonplace that the Crawford siblings, Henry and Mary, serve as foils to Edmund and Fanny. The Crawfords embody the seductions of the material and sensual world, and they amplify the Bertram family's tendency to make ruinous connections. Next slide. But initially, Edmund sees the difference between himself and Mary, between Fanny and Henry Crawford, as a moral benefit. And here's what Edmund says when he tries to convince Fanny to marry Henry. There is a decided difference in your tempers, I allow. He is lively, you are serious, but so much the better. His spirits will support yours. It is your disposition to be easily dejected and to fancy difficulties greater than they are. His cheerfulness will counteract this. Your being so far unlike Fanny does not in the smallest degree make against the probability of your happiness together. Do not imagine it. I am myself convinced that it is a rather favorable circumstance. I am perfectly persuaded that the tempers had better be unlike. Some opposition here is, I am thoroughly convinced, friendly to matrimonial happiness. I exclude all extremes, of course, and a very close resemblance in all those points would be the likeliest way to produce an extreme. Um, Fanny, because she isn't an idiot, quickly perceives Edmund as justifying his own attraction to Mary Crawford. But what's interesting here is the fact that this philosophy of marriage, that in effect difference is what begets marital and familial harmony, is totally thrown out the window by the end of the novel. Next slide. Instead, Mansfield Park culminates with a cousin marriage between Edmund and Fanny, a marriage between two individuals remarkably alike in temperament, values, and of course, blood. The novel's final description of their relationship underscores this similarity. Loving, guiding, protecting her as he had been doing ever since her being 10 years old, her mind in so great a degree formed by his care, and her comfort depending on his kindness, an object to him of such close and peculiar interest, dearer by all his own importance with her than anyone else in Mansfield. What was there now to add but that he should learn to prefer soft light eyes to sparkling dark ones? So, the imaginative cure to the morass of disorder and confusion plaguing the Bertram family and their estate of Mansfield Park is this marriage between two like-minded religionists who think alike, share the same blood, and somewhat restore order. This is what rights an estate that is plagued by its history of making morally dubious connections for morally dubious reasons. And this endogamous marriage, I think, is particularly significant because it is in direct contrast to the earlier philosophy of marriage espoused by Edmund, which favored difference. In other words, Edmund and Fanny's marriage seems to mark a return to a sort of spiritual and moral purity that the novel suggests had been previously compromised by the Bertrams' involvement in colonial enterprises, among their many other morally suspect connections and ventures. If Austen's novel seems to foreground the dangers of cultural and moral contamination linked to colonial wealth and the West Indian influence, the cousin marriage at the novel's conclusion maybe can be interpreted as a metaphorical closing of ranks against such outside influence. And in the context of the history of missionary intermarriage, I speculate this endogamous union perhaps is more significant than it first appears. What seems to be at stake is a sort of religious philosophy of marriage that is in conversation with the moral uncertainties introduced by Britain's expanding empire. Rejecting the early missionary notion that difference and diversity in marriage and family could strengthen the idea of universal kinship, Austen seems to predict and actually align her novel with later missionary policy. In Mansfield Park, the symbolic solution to moral decay is the reinforcement of existing kinship ties at home. But this is a closing of ranks that I think Charlotte Brontë cautiously starts to question in Jane Eyre. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is part 3. The issue of interracial marriage, of course, comes up in coded ways in Jane Eyre. As many literary critics have observed, Rochester's racially ambiguous first wife, the West Indian Creole Bertha Mason, is repeatedly described as a sort of corruption, language expressive of Victorian anxieties surrounding the issue of miscegenation. Yet rarely has this idea of interracial marriage been connected to the novel's concentrated interest in missionary work. The post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak, for instance, characterizes the St. John River's missionary storyline as a tangent narrative, implying that while the Rochester and Bertha narrative touches upon the missionary narrative, the former does not actually significantly intertwine with the latter. I believe, however, that these two narrative registers do enmesh. The link, for me, is to be found in the novel's attention to kinship. Next slide. In Jane Eyre, kinship is explicitly defined by its protagonists. When Jane discovers that St. John Rivers and his sisters Diana and Mary are her first cousins, she exclaims, "I want my kindred, those with whom I have full fellow feeling." And when she inherits 20,000 pounds from her uncle, she insists on splitting the money equally between herself and her newfound relations. Here she states, "I, wealthy, gouged with gold I never earned and do not merit. You, penniless, famous equality and fraternization, close union, intimate attachment." So it's in keeping with Christian understandings of kinship that Jane here associates kinship with equality, union, intimate attachment. Later, I can definitely talk more about how Jane's expectations of what kinship ought to confer are repeatedly disappointed, especially in the reads. However, what I want to focus on for now are the ways that Jane Eyre makes a point of treating marriage as the preeminent expression of these feelings of kinship, as the relationship in which kinship, as Jane understands it, is most perfectly fulfilled. In the world of the novel, marriage I'm going to borrow a phrase from the Victorian writer Margaret Oliphant, really means becoming one person with the profoundest sense of reality and seriousness. To be married in this novel is to be like kin. Mr. Rochester, for instance, prefaces his marriage proposal to Jane with the rhetorical question, "Are you anything akin to me, do you think, Jane?" And Jane expresses her romantic feelings for Rochester in similar language. "I feel akin to him. I have something in my brain and heart, in my blood and nerves that assimilates me mentally to him." When she describes herself as absolutely bone of Rochester's bone, flesh of his flesh at the end of the novel, when they're married, her language not only evokes Adam and Eve's original union, but also its corollary. And this is the idea of the single universal family, which sprung from this first union and which was very regularly evoked by missionary societies. And remember the BMS saying, right? "Shall we not feel for those who are bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh? Shall we not extend this view to the entire world?" Next slide, please. Importantly, Jane and Rochester are not alone in thinking of marriage as a perfect spiritual and physical union. The missionary St. John also stresses marriage to be both the foundation and epitome of kinship ties. Marriage, he remarks, is a means of establishing family ties, and later, when he proposes to Jane, he calls marriage a physical and mental union. Echoing Jane's description of her being absolutely bone of Rochester's bone and flesh of his flesh, St. John declares to Jane that by marrying him, "a part of me you must become." This understanding of marriage as bodily assimilation and perfect kinship seems to be what motivates St. John's unrelenting determination to marry Jane, even after she refuses his proposal for over 3 weeks. Written when the family sphere had become a heavily policed site in missionary work, Jane Eyre alludes to how marriage, precisely because it promised such close union, intimate attachment, seems like a permeable boundary, a site of vulnerability between the civilized white missionary and his would-be spouse. Next slide. Brontë was certainly aware that some of the most respected single missionaries of the early 19th century struggled not to form romantic unions with Indigenous women. Her familiarity with missionary periodicals undoubtedly led her to the story of Vander Kemp in South Africa, and she was acquainted with the story of Henry Martyn, a missionary who worked in India in the first decades of the 19th century, and who was almost certainly the inspiration for the character of St. John. One aspect of Henry Martyn's life that really fascinated British readers was his decision to pursue a life of celibacy in India. Richard Cecil, numerous evangelicals cautioned Martyn that his vow of chastity would be difficult to maintain while he was abroad. For instance, Richard Cecil, the renowned evangelical clergyman, warned Martyn that he would, quote, "be acting like a madman if he went out unmarried," end quote. And Martyn himself admitted in his own writings that it was a formidable prospect to have no female company in, quote, "a scene and climate of such temptation," end quote. Martyn's misgivings ended up proving justified. After only 1 year in India, he called for his English love interest, Lydia Grenfell, to come join him as a missionary's wife, and Lydia, it's worth mentioning, never came. Jane Eyre alludes to these temptations, I believe, in its juxtaposition of Rochester's West India with the India of St. John's missionary work. Not only do the British holdings share names and hot climates in the novel, but Rochester also describes his first wife, the voluptuous Bertha, as his Indian Messalina, a woman he marries specifically for her wealth and whom he holds up as an object example of what he calls the risks, the horrors, the loathings of incongruous unions. So with Rochester's sensuous and racially ambiguous Indian wife haunting the narrative, St. John's request, next slide, please, that is for Jane to help him amongst Indian women by becoming his wife, takes on new significance, perhaps even a double meaning. Indeed, when St. John's desire to wed Jane is examined in the broader context of the novel's historical setting in the early 1830s, a moment, as I mentioned before, when missionary societies were pressuring all their missionaries to wed before leaving England, before leaving Britain, to guard better against sensuous temptations abroad, we begin to see that St. John's determination to wed Jane is perhaps spurred by deep-seated anxiety about becoming a part of a racially other wife. Wedding Jane is for him a prophylactic measure, one that will maintain what the novel says is his chief character trait, his incorruptibility, because in marrying Jane, he kind of figures that he is essentially marrying himself. But Jane Eyre also expresses more than this. It also highlights the hypocrisy inherent to the missionary movement. For someone who, as a missionary, necessarily sought to extend universal kinship, the novel seems to condemn the way that St. John restricts his choice of wife to a woman who, in the strictest sense, is already his kin. Jane, after all, is not just a close blood relative of St. John, she is also already named for St. John, right? He is her namesake. So next slide. In this way, the novel counterpoises the missionary's lofty goal of realizing the universal human family, of working for the human race, with how strictly he constrains his marriage choice to one who is already of his race, who shares the same blood and the same name as him. Brontë, in other words, seems interested in exposing what she takes to be a pretty major disjunction in missionary work. And this was the way in which missionary societies proclaimed the so-called dark heathens of the world to be British Christians, brother, sister, cousin, child, even as these same missionary societies were ever more strictly policing the makeup of actual Christian families along racial lines. Thus, Jane Eyre, while warning against the moral rot of colonial wealth, the dangers of incongruous unions, refuses the solution hesitatingly proposed by Mansfield Park and more fully endorsed by missionary societies themselves. It simply refuses that the corruption of colonialism can be prevented or mitigated by this sort of prophylactic marriage between like-minded, like-blooded religionists. Rochester's union to Bertha is bad, but St. John's solution is also bad because it is so antithetical to the spirit of Christian universal kinship. A kinship, remember, built on equality and openness according to Christian evangelical writings. So next slide, and this is my conclusion, my very brief conclusion. So to sum up, I want to suggest that the connection between Austen and Brontë lies in their exploration of a central paradox: the clash between Christian kinship and the reality of imperial era's social boundaries. This tension was embodied in the missionary movement itself, which preached universal human brotherhood while simultaneously enforcing ever stricter familial boundaries. In Mansfield Park, Austen suggests that colonial influence maybe necessitates such boundaries. The Bertrams' symbolic moral rehabilitation comes through an endogamous marriage. The novel thus advocates for a sort of domestic fortification against colonial corruption. But this solution, of course, is a conservative one. The Bertrams never abandoned their Antiguan plantation, but instead simply closed ranks. Bronte's later work more explicitly critiques evangelical hypocrisy in keeping with the times. In Jane Eyre, St. John Rivers, who should exemplify Christian universal kinship, paradoxically seeks a cousin marriage to preemptively shut down potentially dangerous channels of openness and attachment with the people among whom he will eventually work in the mission field. In other words, Jane Eyre foregrounds this growing chasm between missionary ideals and missionary practice. Both authors then grapple with a fundamental anxiety at the core of British imperial culture, and they really bring it to the foreground, I think. The empire required a belief in British Christian superiority to justify itself, but it also espoused Christian ideals of a single universal humanity. This was an unresolvable tension that played out not only in missionary policies, but also, as I think as I've speculated, in the literature of the time. Often, I think, first-time readers of Jane Eyre and Mansfield Park see these novels as domestic marriage plots, stubbornly ensconced in a limited geographic range, safely insulated from a troubled and troubling global context. But as this missionary history makes clear, domestic intimacy and global anxieties were always tightly intertwined. The most personal choices were inescapably political. We would be doing these novels then a grave disservice to see their explorations of intimate family relations as severed from their allusions to the broader imperial context. Thank you.
All
Very
right.
good.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful talk. We are going to kind of start our Q&A time of this talk. So please, if you're in the audience, submit your questions to the chat and we will bring them up on the screen for Jade to respond to. I wanted to, Jade, make sure you saw this comment that came in about halfway through your talk. You have a fan in the audience.
Hi, Mason. And hi, Gia.
So thank you again, Jade, for that wonderful talk.
Yeah.
And again, and also, if you would prefer, you could email your questions to our Jane Austen and Company email address in the day. We'll have that kind of broadcasted in a second. It's info@janeaustenandco.org. You can also email your questions there. While you're typing out questions and that kind of thing, I wanted to get the ball rolling by this. We're kind of at this moment in Austen's career. She published Pride and Prejudice. She kind of famously, I think, tells her sister like she was happy with the novel, but she thought it was too light, bright, and sparkling. It wants shade. And then she writes Mansfield Park after that.
Yeah.
Do you think that with Mansfield Park, Austen is kind of embarking on a slightly more like critical, investigative dissection of British society? It seems a very just different kind of tone than her other novels.
Yeah, and I remember, right, didn't she actually write about Mansfield Park in one of her letters? This is my novel about ordination, right? Like, so she was very, very conscious that Mansfield Park was going to be a novel that really seriously talked about religion in a way I think Pride and Prejudice doesn't. And I think that there's something in what you're saying, Eric, as well, where I actually was just talking about this with my my class yesterday. Hello, if anyone from English 325 is here, hello to all of you. You remember this, but Fanny Price, I think one of the most divisive issue among like the Austen community is that Fanny Price is not a sparkly heroine, right? Nina Auerbach famously called her unconvivial and charmless, which I think is just really really funny, frankly. So but I think that like Fanny Price gives her an opportunity to explore several things that haven't come up as fully in her novels before, but do start coming up in like Persuasion, right? And also in Emma, which comes out right after Mansfield Park. And this is like the situation in the West Indies. There are allusions to slavery and also with Mansfield Park, like a pretty serious in-depth look about the state of religious teaching in England at this time. So my answer is yes. I think that she was doing something a bit different with Mansfield Park.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think it's throughout that novel, you know, she's got references to Cooper's poetry, for instance, where, I mean, and he's talking about both slavery and religion and preaching in the course of the task. And there's all that emphasis on preaching itself. So she's, I think it's so complicated and or so complex in terms of what she's doing, and what you've just given us, you know, I still don't have any questions because I'm still just going, wow. You know, it's really so fascinating to think about it by putting those two threads together and holding them together through the missionary element.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Actually, this is a tendency that I've noticed that runs through. My field is Victorian studies, right? But it's something that runs through Victorian literary studies a little bit, which is I think we tend to keep discussions of religion, like real discussions of religion and imperialism, a little bit separated from each other, right? Like when we talk about religion, it's usually in the domestic context. And then when religion comes up in sort of talking about the context of British Empire, it tends to come up as though it was just kind of bad faith cover for like bad politics, right? Like, or for politics in other forms, or economic policy in other forms, which actually allows us to get rid of religion and start talking about the things we actually want to talk about, which is politics, economics, right? But I think that what I'm trying to do is hold both of these things in tension with each other, right? Like seriously consider religion and seriously consider imperialism at the same time, in the way that I think Charlotte Brontë does, in the way that I think Jane Austen also gestures towards.
Well, and doesn't that make sense? Because the abolition movement was largely pushed by evangelicals like Wilberforce and others.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
They weren't separate. We just want to separate them.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the Clapham sect, William Wilberforce, they were really movers and shakers in an earlier moment in time too, like the sort of religious revivalists, like the Methodists, various dissenting sects were really behind the abolition movement. But that said, let me just put like a little star next to this too, which is to say, you know, that there is research that has shown that the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which is the oldest, I believe it was the oldest missionary society associated with the Anglican Church, it actually ran an estate, the Codrington estate, and it was a slaveholding plantation in, I believe, Barbados, right? And they held that up until 1833. And so right now, in this current moment, SPG is still making amends for this and still reckoning with this really problematic history. So missionary societies were not monolithic. They weren't all on the same political agenda. And I just wanted to kind of underscore that. I do think it's significant that Jane Austen, when she donated to a missionary society, it was not to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel.
Okay.
So here's a good question. Here, you can see that there. It's not showing the question. There it is. Fanny does seem evangelical in her philosophy, but do you think Mrs. Norris is even more evangelical? What do you make of the character of her and evangelicalism in the novel?
That's a great question. I would say that Mrs. Norris, you know, was married to Mr. Norris and he had a living. He's Church of England, right? And one of the things that I think Mrs. Norris might represent is sort of the ways in which kind of a religion of the heart, like, you know, religious practice or like real moral values for Austen had been sort of evacuated out of just the living of the, you know, right, like Mr. Norris had a living, had just been kind of evacuated out in like the occupation of the church, I think, right? Because what Edmund wants to do is that he wants to kind of he takes his job, his calling as a clergyman, really seriously in a way that is implied that that Mr. Norris that certainly Mrs. Norris doesn't do. So I you know, I think there's actually a critique of Mrs. Norris's like the way in which she superficially pretends to have Christian values, but in her heart is not a Christian at all, right? There's a real divide between the way Mrs. Norris treats Fanny and how Edmund treats Fanny. I think that that's always brought to the fore in Mansfield Park.
Not to mention that she's a thief.
Oh yeah, where she's taking like eggs and I love what a funny scene, right?
Yeah.
We're getting several good questions in from the audience.
Yeah.
There's one that I want to skip to because I don't want to lose the thread. Jade, you were referencing something earlier, and we got more of a comment, I guess, from Jamie. He says, Jamie says, also ties to the East India Company's shipping of English women to India for the British men to stop the interracial marriages / relationships going on there, the fishing fleets. I'm unfamiliar with this.
As am I. I haven't studied the East India Company in this regard at all. So thank you so much, Jamie. This is really, really helpful. This gives me something to look into.
Well, what about George Austen's sister was sent to India to marry? Yeah. So I don't know if that's part of the East India Company.
No, but she also writes about it in Catherine or the Bower.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we do know that Charlotte, I mean, I won't speak for Austen. Maybe let me switch to Charlotte just for a moment. Charlotte Brontë, like, she writes this poem called The Missionary, as some of you might know. And it just, for me, what this poem really demonstrates is the ways in which this issue of missionary marriage, right? Because remember, in this poem, The Missionary, gosh, he talks about his love, leaving behind his love interest, Helen. He he talks about like how I've overcome my carnal will. I think carnal will is an actual quote from that. But it just shows that like missionary marriages, particularly this issue of like kind of missionaries being celibate abroad, or perhaps like the issue of a missionary wife, was very much on the mind of some of these novelists. They were acquainted with this as being a problem.
Don't you wonder too, or I wonder too, so I shouldn't just say, don't you wonder, but how much that fear that celibacy won't hold has to do with a kind of British Church of England and Protestant anti-Catholicism. I mean, to say, let's send out celibate missionaries is too much like what Catholics would do. And
that it's concerns with anti-Catholicism. Yeah, that's a great point. That's actually a really, really fantastic point. I hadn't thought about that fully, but it does make a lot of sense, right? Because of course, for one of the ways in which we know, especially kind of more evangelical sects distinguish themselves from Catholicism is that they held that like, kind of the perfect sexual union was not, the union necessarily like of being celibate because you have given yourself to God, as they imagine the Catholics did, right? But it was the perfect union between a man and a wife, right? That was the idealized union. So that's a fantastic thought.
I had a question. It's always, every time I reread Jane Eyre, I'm always a little bit surprised how, it is underneath it all, it is a great romantic story, but yet the whole ending is about St. John.
Yeah, it is.
And it goes from this, oh, everything's great, and then it's all about him for the last two paragraphs of the novel. And
isn't that
he dies? I know, and he dies at the end. And I'm wondering, is it? I have to think about it. Is there any mention that he ever marries?
No, he doesn't.
That's part of why he might fail there.
Oh yeah. That is true. And one of the things that I think has to be ironic in Jane Eyre, right, is that at one point, St. John says, my vocation, my calling as a missionary, and this is the direct quote, is dearer to me than the blood in my veins. And it turns out that is, in fact, the choice that he makes, right? In trying to be an incorruptible, pure missionary, right? Like, I think at the end of the novel, he says he anticipates his sure reward, his incorruptible crown. He has held dearly to like this vocation of a missionary. He literally sacrifices, I think, like within this context, the blood in his veins, because he doesn't have children. He's also the last of his line. He's the last Rivers, right? So
Right.
the Rivers line will no longer exist now that St. John is dead. So his vocation as a missionary has demanded that sacrifice.
Yeah. So yeah, there's some good questions. Eric, you want to?
Yeah.
John Rivers' sisters.
So speaking of characters who don't marry, we got this question from Katie. What do you make of Tom Bertram's absence from the novel's marriage plots, whether good or bad marriages, especially given his homosocial relationships? That's a good one.
That's a really interesting one. Katie, I wish that we were in conversation with each other, because I would love to ask you what would you make of it? I mean, in light of the Nibs episode, like, is Tom Bertram's sort of denial of having this happy marriage just sort of registering of the way that, James Nibs Jr. died in Antigua, right? Like, and we know that she does not want to dwell, let other pens dwell on guilt and misery, right? Like, this is not the point of Austen's novel. She doesn't want to make you feel bad, but still, maybe she's somewhat registering the death of James Nibs Jr. in Antigua in Tom Bertram's sort of somewhat unhappy ending. But I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what others think.
Yeah, and I Tom being kind of the firstborn son, that kind of line of inheritance being messed up, because at least as far as the novel is concerned, he's not married to produce an heir. So I feel like there's your earlier point about kind of the inward state of Mansfield Park is kind of dilapidated or falling apart or decaying. Is that part of why Tom doesn't get that kinship tie of marriage?
Yeah. I mean, it could be that really, like, it's part of this, what I called the metaphoric closing of the ranks that Mansfield Park enacts by the end of the novel. Really, we only have one son who marries, right? And he marries his first cousin.
And it also, seems to get at Austen's sort of growing skepticism about the traditional, patrilineal inheritance that gets picked up again in Persuasion. Where the baronetage is seen as a kind of corrupt institution, and we're moving to the Navy instead.
Yeah, that's right. That's really interesting.
Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Okay, I was just gonna say, take a look at this question. I'm really curious about what happened to the native women who married missionaries and the children who were renamed. I suppose the women became Bertha Masons, but what about the names?
I cannot follow up with the children who were symbolically renamed. That was just kind of like a way. And also, hi, Kim. Hello. And what a great question. But I can't really speak to the children who were renamed. I'd love to follow up on it and see what happened to it, but it happened to them. But that's archival research I just haven't done yet. For the Native women who married missionaries, though, one of the things, there's lots of different case studies. For some of them, for George Vason, he says, like, eventually my marriage rendered me very unhappy. And part of the reason why it renders him unhappy is that she becomes indifferent to him. His native wife becomes completely indifferent to him, essentially abandons him. And he turns back towards, like, he comes repentantly back to England and publishes this very repentant autobiography. But fascinatingly, in some of these other cases, there's evidence that these relationships were ones of real mutuality. What little evidence we have. So there is a book that's written by Elizabeth Elburn. It's called Bloodground, and she's the one who really studies a lot of these missionary intermarriages in South Africa in particular. And what she suggests from the research that she's done is things such as that Vanderkamp's wife really tried to protect his estate, which surprised me. Her research also suggests that a different missionary, and his name is Sanditon, a Dutch missionary, he actually had a wife, Johanna, a native woman named Johanna in South Africa. And they have, I'm sorry, I'm going to just read from my own book if I can find it, because it's such an interesting moment. Oh, no, I'm sorry. His name is Michael Wimmer. And so this is what he writes, right, to Susanna. His wife, Susanna, despaired at being told by the white settlers of the unlawfulness of their union. And he tries to console her. He recounts reassuring Susanna that since their problems were only, and this is the direct quote, only because you are a Hottentot woman and no other reason is in the way, will you do as I? Here is my hand. I take you this evening to be my wife. And she did the same, end quote, right? And it's this actually incredibly moving account of them like loving each other despite the barriers that are being put in the way by missionaries in South Africa who had married white settlers.
Cool. Thank you for that. We have still about 5 to 7 minutes left for Q&A and several more questions to go through.
There's an interesting question by Lori Mulligan Davis that takes about 6 screens, so I'm just going to try to summarize it quickly. She says that you talk about moral contagion, and she says that it had at the time 2 very different ramifications in Austen's day, both meaning spreading, but the OED says it has good and bad connotations. So Gibbon, for instance, in 1871 says the contagion of morality and repentance was morality, I think that is, and repentance was communicated from rank to rank. Anyway, so that's the most important part of that. But I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting idea that contagion can be good as well as bad.
Yeah. And that's exactly how Sarah Lewis, who was herself married to a missionary, but Sarah Lewis and Women's Mission, right? Like this is exactly how she is using moral contagion in this really positive sense, right? She is saying that it is a good thing that unconscious influence flows from one party to the other as a sort of moral contagion. This is something that we are supposed to aspire to in marriage. And I guess the way that I am reading it is that but this is double-edged, right? Because once you marry somebody who is very unlike you, right? Somebody who's racially other, someone who's culturally other, this sort of moral contagion takes on the more negative valence of corruption rather than shared spirits, right? Rather than kind of unconscious sort of communion with each other, it becomes corruption. And so I'm really playing around with that double meaning of contagion in this essay and in other work that I've done. I really appreciate you highlighting that. Thank you.
Okay, here's another question. Let's see. This is from Ariana Del Mastro. Do you think that Diana and Mary Rivers, their similarities to Jane, them being unwed, living with their brother, etc., are relevant to the novel's conceptions of kinship / marriage / union?
Oh, wow. And Ree, I just want to say hi to you. Ree is a former student. Thanks, Ree, for giving me such a tough question. I really appreciate that. No, but in all earnestness, Ree, if you were here, I would turn this around and say, what do you think about Diana and Mary Rivers, right? Their similarities to Jane, them being unwed, living with their brother. Well, one of the things that comes to mind for me is that, of course, St. John he cannot marry his sister, right? But Jane becomes his sister. She is essentially like Diana and Mary Rivers, right? She is living among them. She calls them, I think, at one point, they're her sisters, right? Like she's kin. So she comes as close to being like a sister. I mean, we are approaching the incest taboo here, right? Like, so when St. John is looking to marry Jane, he is literally trying to get as close as possible without breaking the incest taboo to marrying someone like himself. So that's what I think is partly happening there. There's probably a lot more happening there, but in my mind, I think that's partly what's happening there.
Can I add to that question? Because I wanted to ask that question myself, so I'm very excited that Ariana did that. What about, don't they say, one of the sisters says something like, don't marry him, he'll kill you or you'll die. I mean, there's this kind of sense that if Jane marries St. John Rivers, and it's been a while since I've read it, but that they feel that this is a certain death. And I don't think it's just her physical frailty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is absolutely, I mean, historically, that's just true, right? Going out to India in some ways as a missionary's wife was really thought to be certain death. I think that there's, what is her name? Patricia Grimshaw, I think, is a historian that's done work on the history of missionary women. But one of the things she talks about is in the beginning of the 19th century, this was essentially like a death sentence, right? The mortality rate was incredibly, incredibly high.
But do you think it's only the mortality rate they mean, or is there something in that marriage, that kinship marriage, that they think would swallow Jane up?
Yeah, I do think there is, right? Because I think that it's significant that St. John says, a part of me you must become, right? That's his proposal. A part of me you must become. He will metaphorically swallow up his entire being. And this is kind of referred to again and again in this part of Jane Eyre. She feels like that, right? Like she feels as though that she's going to be swallowed up by St. John's sort of despotic ambition, his overbearing personality.
Yeah, there's a great quote when he puts his hand on her head and she says, I feel like I'm been contracted in a shroud. That's her response to him. It's very powerful. And I think the sisters are aware of their brother's inability to truly love, the love that Jane had and needed in her life. So,
well,
yes.
I mean, it actually, I sometimes wonder about whether or not, since you brought it up, I do wonder about St. John's capacity for love, because we do have Rosamund Oliver here in Jane Eyre. And I think that that's really interesting. Actually, this is where I see the most similarity between Jane Eyre and then Charlotte Bronte's poem, The Missionary, where the missionary says that I'm going to deny my love for Helen in favor of becoming a missionary abroad. And we really see that with St. John too. I don't know, but whether or not he's capable of really loving, I think is an open question. Yeah, I don't know.
So I think we have time for maybe one or two questions more, and there's some from the chat that I've been trying to get to. And I'm going to share this question because I have a follow-up to it. This was asked many, many minutes ago. Is there any evidence of personal relationship between Jane Austen and missionaries? We talked earlier about the donation that Austen made. And then, Jade, you mentioned some kind of minute detail about what she did not donate to. Could you just refresh my memory?
It wasn't really anything. She did donate to the society so it was just the local society. They were setting up a small district branch for the Society of Promoting Christian Knowledge, so SPCK. It's one of the old Anglican mission organizations in Britain. And I was just kind of making a flippant comment that it wasn't the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which is a different society, but that was the society that that had a plantation.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you for that. Susan or Deb, is there any last questions that you want to ask, or should we wrap up?
I think we can wrap up. I mean, this is fascinating. We could go on all night.
Go on.
Really
We
could.
could go on. A fascinating talk.
I mean, I would like to say, what about the money? And at the end of Jane Eyre, I mean, because she inherits that money that is from the colonies, and
Yeah, from Madeira. Mhm.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to know, what do people, I mean, is it significant that the money comes from Madeira, right? Like, I think that Jane chooses her locations really carefully, and I'm reminded of that part in Emma, actually, right, where I think it's Mrs. Elton who, that, like, there's that joke, right, where she says Bristol, not
Yes.
it's not bad, Bristol, right?
Yeah.
But like it shows that like Jane chooses, oh gosh, I'm talking about Jane Austen, not Charlotte Brontë. Both of them are immaculate though, like, right, like both of them are like pinpoint their locations very, very carefully. But yeah, but I think that the Madeira is important. I'd be curious to look into it.
Yeah.
So any more questions? What's our time, Eric?
I think we got to wrap up in 4 minutes, and we got some announcements to make.
We have a few things to do.
Okay.
So, all right,
right.
then I'm going to sum up. Thank you so much, Jay. That was fabulous. And now I'll be thinking about it all night. Thank you to everybody in our audience for being here. Please stick around as we have more news about the Jane Austen and Company programs coming up. And I'm going to turn things over to Eric, who's going to share that information with us. So again, thank you everyone for joining us.
And thank you for leaving comments in the chat, thanking Jade for her talk. So our next event will be a week from this Thursday. It takes place on Thursday, November 7th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll get to hear from Dr. Claire O'Callaghan. Please note that this event starts at a slightly earlier and slightly unusual time to accommodate our international speaker. And then in general, we know that not everyone is in a place to donate to Jane Austen and Company, but we are committed to keeping these events free and open to the public and widely accessible. If you are able to donate, please consider doing so. We have been particularly proud to continue to offer a pay what you can format for registering for these events. And so, again, if you are able, please consider donating. And even a few dollars can help and make a big difference in our ability to produce new contents for Jane Austen and Company.
And just a reminder, the recording of tonight's presentation will be posted to our website, janeaustenandco.org, and to YouTube very soon after we finish tonight. And if you can't wait until our next event and you've got time, you can view any of our previous programs on the website. Our website contains the archive of all our previous lectures. There are over 40 of them now, on topics ranging from bookbinding in the age of Austen to questionable home remedies from the Regency and the unexpected connections between Austen and Byron. We've enjoyed bringing you this thought-provoking programming for the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great evening or day, depending on what part of the world you're in. Thank you, Jade, for a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you all.